Chapter 11 of Hans Brinker. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording is by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. Hans Brinker, or The Silver Skates, by Mary Mapes Dodge. Chapter 11. Big Manias and Little Oddities. While skating along at full speed, they heard the cars from Amsterdam coming close behind them. "Halloo!" cried Ludwig, glancing toward the rail track. "Who can't beat a locomotive? Let's give it a race!" The whistles screamed at the very idea. So did the boys, and at it they went. For an instant the boys were ahead, hurrahing with all their might. Only for an instant, but even that was something. Their excitement over, they began to travel more leisurely and indulge in conversation and frolic. Sometimes they stopped to exchange a word with the guards who were stationed at certain distances along the canal. These men, in winter, attend to keeping the surface free from obstruction and garbage. After a snowstorm they are expected to sweep the feathery coating away before it hardens into a marble, pretty to look at, but very unwelcome to skaters. Now and then the boys so far forgot their dignity as to clamber among the ice-bound canal boats crowded together in a widened harbor off the canal, but the watchful guards would soon spy them out and order them down with a growl. Nothing could be straighter than the canal upon which our party were skating, and nothing straighter than the long rows of willow trees that stood, bare and wispy, along the bank. On the opposite side, lifted high above the surrounding country, lay the carriage road on top of the great dike built to keep the Haarlem Lake within bounds. Stretching out far in the distance, until it became lost in a point, was the glassy canal with its many skaters, its brown-winged ice-boats, its push-chairs, and its queer little sleds, light as cork, flying over the ice by means of iron-pronged sticks in the hands of the riders. Ben was in ecstasy with the scene. Ludwig van Holp had been thinking how strange it was that the English boy should know so much of Holland. According to Lambert's account, he knew more about it than the Dutch did. This did not quite please our young Hollander. Suddenly he thought of something that he believed would make the Jean Paul open his eyes. He drew near Lambert with a triumphant, "Tell him about the tulips." Ben caught the word tulpen. "Oh, yes," said he eagerly in English. "The tulip mania. Are you speaking of that? I have often heard it mentioned, but know very little about it. It reached its height in Amsterdam, didn't it?" Ludwig moaned. The words were hard to understand, but there was no mistaking the enlightened expression on Ben's face. Lambert, happily, was quite unconscious of his young countryman's distress as he replied, "Yes, here and in Haarlem, principally. But the excitement ran high all over Holland, and in England too, for that matter." Hardly in England. Although the tulip mania did not prevail in England as in Holland, the flower soon became an object of speculation and brought very large prices. In 1636 tulips were publicly sold on the Exchange of London. Even as late as 1800 a common price was 15 guineas for one bulb. Ben did not know that in his own day a single tulip plant, called the Fanny Kemble, had been sold in London for more than 70 guineas. Mr. Mackay, in his Memoirs of Popular Delusions, tells a funny story of an English botanist who happened to see a tulip bulb lying in the conservatory of a wealthy Dutchman. Ignorant of its value, he took out his penknife and, cutting the bulb in two, became very much interested in his investigations. Suddenly the owner appeared, and pouncing furiously upon him, asked if he knew what he was doing. "Peeling a most extraordinary onion," replied the philosopher. "100,000 duivel!" shouted the Dutchman. it's an Admiral van der Eyck." "Thank you," replied the traveler, immediately writing the name in his notebook. "Pray, are these very common in your country?" "Death and the duivel!" screamed the Dutchman. "Come before the syndic and you shall see." In spite of his struggles, the poor investigator, followed by an indignant mob, was taken through the streets to a magistrate. Soon he learned to his dismay that he had destroyed a bulb worth 4,000 florins, or $1,600. He was lodged in prison until securities could be procured for the payment of the sum. "I think," said Ben, "but I am not sure, as I was not there at the time." "Ha! That's true, unless you are over 200 years old. Well, I tell you, sir, there never was anything like it before nor since. Why, persons were so crazy after tulip bulbs in those days that they paid their weight in gold for them." "What? The weight of a man?" cried Ben, showing such astonishment in his eyes that Ludwig fairly capered. "No, no, the weight of a bulb. The first tulip was sent here from Constantinople about the year 1560. It was so much admired that the rich people of Amsterdam sent to Turkey for more. From that time they grew to be the rage, and it lasted for years. Single roots brought from 1 to 4,000 florins, and one bulb, the Semper Augustus, brought 5,500. "That's more than 400 guineas of our money," interposed Ben. "Yes, and I know I'm right, for I read it in a translation from Beckman only day before yesterday. Well, sir, it was great. Everyone speculated in tulips, even bargemen and ragwomen and chimney sweeps. The richest merchants were not ashamed to share the excitement. People bought bulbs and sold them again at a tremendous profit without ever seeing them. It grew into a kind of gambling. Some became rich by it in a few days, and some lost everything they had. Land, houses, cattle, and even clothing went for tulips when people had no ready money. Ladies sold their jewels and finery to enable them to join in the fun. Nothing else was thought of. At last the States General interfered. People began to see what dunces they were making of themselves, and down went the price of tulips. Old tulip debts couldn't be collected. Creditors went to law, and the law turned its back upon them. Debts made in gambling were not binding, it said. Then there was a time. Thousands of rich speculators were reduced to beggary in an hour. As old Beckman says, the bubble was burst at last." "Yes, and a big bubble it was," said Ben, who had listened with great interest. "By the way, did you know that the name tulip came from a Turkish word signifying turban?" "I had forgotten that," answered Lambert. "But it's a capital idea. Just fancy a party of Turks in full headgear squatted upon a lawn. Perfect tulip bed. Ha 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 ha! Capital idea." "There," groaned Ludwig to himself. "He's been telling Lambert something wonderful about tulips. I knew it." "The fact is," continued Lambert, "you can conjure up quite a human picture of a tulip bed in bloom, especially when it is nodding and bobbing in the wind. Did you ever notice it?" "Not I. It strikes me, Van Mounen, that you Hollanders are prodigiously fond of the flower to this day." "Certainly. You can't have a garden without them. Prettiest flower that grows, I think. My uncle has a magnificent bed of the finest varieties at his summer house on the other side of Amsterdam." "I thought your uncle lived in the city?" "So he does, but his summer house, or pavilion, is a few miles off. He has another one built out over the river. We passed near it when we entered the city. Everybody in Amsterdam has a pavilion somewhere, if he can." "Do they ever live there?" asked Ben. "Bless you, no. They are small affairs, suitable only to spend a few hours in on summer afternoons. There are some beautiful ones on the southern end of the Haarlem Lake, Now that they've commenced to drain it into polders, it will spoil that fun. By the way, we've passed some red-roofed ones since we left home. You noticed them, I suppose, with their little bridges and ponds and gardens, and their mottos over the doorway." Ben nodded. "They make but little show now," continued Lambert, "but in warm weather they are delightful. After the willows sprout, Uncle goes to his summer house every afternoon. He dozes and smokes. Aunt knits, with her feet perched upon a foot-stove, never mind how hot the day. My cousin Rika and the other girls fish in the lake from the windows or chat with their friends rowing by, and the youngsters tumble about or hang upon the little bridges over the ditch. Then they have coffee and cakes, beside a great bunch of water lilies on the table. It's very fine, I can tell you. Only, between ourselves, though I was born here, I shall never fancy the odor of stagnant water that hangs about most of the summer houses. Nearly every one you see is built over a ditch. Probably I feel it more, from having lived so long in England." "Perhaps I shall notice it too," said Ben, "if a thaw comes. The early winter has covered up the fragrant waters for my benefit. Much obliged to it. Holland without this glorious skating wouldn't be the same thing at all." "How very different you are from the Poots!" exclaimed Lambert, who had been listening in a sort of brown study. "And yet you are cousins. I cannot understand it." "We are cousins, or rather we have always considered ourselves such, but the relationship is not very close. Our grandmothers were half-sisters. My side of the family is entirely English, while he is entirely Dutch. Old great-grandfather Poot married twice, you see, and I am a descendant of his English wife. I like Jacob, though, better than half of my English cousins put together. He is the truest-hearted, best-natured boy I ever knew. Strange as you may think it, my father became accidentally acquainted with Jacob's father while on a business visit to Rotterdam. They soon talked over their relationship, in French, by the way, and they have corresponded in the language ever since. Queer things come about in this world. My sister Jenny would open her eyes at some of Aunt Poot's ways. Aunt is a thorough lady, but no different from Mother, and the house too, and furniture, and way of living, everything is different." "Of course," assented Lambert, complacently, as if to say you could scarcely expect such general perfection anywhere else than in Holland. "But you will have all the more to tell Jenny when you go back." "Yes, indeed. I can say one thing. If cleanliness is, as they claim, next to godliness, Broek is safe. It is the cleanest place I ever saw in my life. Why, my Aunt Poot, rich as she is, scrubs half the time, and her house looks as if it were varnished all over. I wrote to Mother yesterday that I could see my double always with me, feet to feet, in the polished floor of the dining room." "Your double? That word puzzles me. What do you mean?" "Oh, my reflection, my apparition. Ben Dobbs number 2. "Ah, I see," exclaimed Van Mounen. "Have you ever been in your Aunt Poot's grand parlor?" Ben laughed. "Only once, and that was on the day of my arrival. Jacob says I shall have no chance of entering it again until the time of his sister Cannaw's wedding, the week after Christmas. Father has consented that I shall remain to witness the great event. Every Saturday Aunt Poot and her fat Kate go into that parlor and sweep and polish and scrub. Then it is darkened and closed until Saturday comes again. Not a soul enters it in the meantime. But the schoenemachen, as she calls it, must be done just the same." "That is nothing. Every parlor in Broek meets with the same treatment," said Lambert. "What do you think of those moving figures in her neighbor's garden?" "Oh, they're well enough. The swans must seem really alive gliding about the pond in summer, but that nodding mandarin in the corner, under the chestnut trees, is ridiculous, only fit for children to laugh at. And then the stiff garden patches, and the trees all trimmed and painted. Excuse me, Van Monen, but I shall never learn to admire Dutch taste." "It will take time," answered Lambert condescendingly, "but you are sure to agree with it at last. I saw much to admire in England, and I hope I shall be sent back with you to study at Oxford. But, take everything together, I like Holland best." "Of course you do," said Ben in a tone of hearty approval. "You wouldn't be a good Hollander if you didn't. Nothing like loving one's country. It is strange, though, to have such a warm feeling for such a cold place. If we were not exercising all the time, we should freeze outright." Lambert laughed. "That's your English blood, Benjamin. I'm not cold. And look at the skaters here on the canal. They're red as roses and happy as lords. Halloo, good Captain van Holp," called out Lambert in Dutch. "What say you to stopping at yonder farmhouse and warming our toes?" "Who's cold?" asked Peter, turning around. "Benjamin Dobbs." "Benjamin Dobbs shall be warmed," and the party was brought to a halt. End of chapter. Chapter 12 of Hans Brinker. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording is by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. Hans Brinker, or The Silver Skates, by Mary Mapes Dodge. Chapter 12. On the Way to Haarlem. On approaching the door of the farmhouse, the boys suddenly found themselves in the midst of a lively domestic scene. A burly Dutchman came rushing out, closely followed by his dear vrouw, and she was beating him smartly with her long-handled warming pan. The expression on her face gave our boys so little promise of a kind reception that they prudently resolved to carry their toes elsewhere to be warmed. The next cottage proved to be more inviting. Its low roof of bright red tiles extended over the cow stable that, clean as could be, nestled close to the main building. A neat, peaceful-looking old woman sat at one window, knitting. At the other could be discerned part of the profile of a fat figure that, pipe in mouth, sat behind the shining little panes and snowy curtain. In answer to Peter's subdued knock, a fair-haired, rosy-cheeked lass in holiday attire opened the upper half of the green door, which was divided across the middle, and inquired their errand. "May we enter and warm ourselves, jufvrouw?" asked the captain respectfully. "Yes, and welcome," was the reply as the lower half of the door swung softly towards its mate. Every boy, before entering, rubbed long and faithfully upon the rough mat, and each made his best bow to the old lady and gentleman at the window. Ben was half inclined to think that these personages were automata like the moving figures in the garden at Broek, for they both nodded their heads slowly in precisely the same way, and both went on with their employment as steadily and stiffly as though they worked by machinery. The old man puffed, and his vrouw clicked her knitting needles as if regulated by internal cogwheels. Even the real smoke issuing from the motionless pipe gave no convincing proof that they were human. But the rosy-cheeked maiden, ah, how she bustled about! How she gave the boys polished high-backed chairs to sit upon! How she made the fire blaze as if it were inspired! How she made Jacob Poot almost weep for joy by bringing forth a great square of gingerbread and a stone jug of sour wine! How she laughed and nodded as the boys ate like wild animals on good behavior! And how blank she looked when Ben politely but firmly refused to take any black bread and sauerkraut! How she pulled off Jacob's mitten, which was torn at the thumb, and mended it before his eyes, biting off the thread with her white teeth, and saying, "Now it will be warmer," as she bit. And finally, how she shook hands with every boy in turn, and, throwing a deprecating glance at the female automaton, insisted upon filling their pockets with gingerbread. All this time the knitting needles clicked on, and the pipe never missed a puff. When the boys were fairly on their way again, they came in sight of the Zwanenburg castle with its massive stone front and its gateway towers, each surmounted with a sculptured swan. Halfweg, halfway. Boys, said Peter, off with your skates. You see, explained Lambert to his companions, the Eye and the Haarlem Lake meeting here make it rather troublesome. The river is 5 feet higher than the land, so we must have everything strong in the way of dikes and sluice gates, or there would be wet work at once. The sluice arrangements are supposed to be something extra. We will walk over them, and you shall see enough to make you open your eyes. The spring water of the lake, they say, has the most wonderful bleaching powers of any in the world. All the great Haarlem bleacheries use it. I can't say much upon that subject, but I can tell you one thing from personal experience. What is that? Why, the lake is full of the biggest eels you ever saw. I've caught them here, often. Perfectly prodigious. I tell you, they're sometimes a match for a fellow. They'd almost wriggle your arm from the socket if you were not on your guard. But you're not interested in eels, I perceive. The castle's a big affair, isn't it? Yes. What do those swans mean? Anything? Asked Ben, looking up at the stone gate towers. The swan is held almost in reverence by us Hollanders. These give the building its name, Zwanenburg, Swan Castle. That is all I know. This is a very important spot, for it is here that the wise ones hold council with regard to dike matters. The castle was once the residence of the celebrated Christian Brunings. What about him? Asked Ben. Peter could answer you better than I, said Lambert, if you could only understand each other, or were not such cowards about leaving your mother tongues. But I have often heard my grandfather speak of Brunings. He is never tired of telling us of the great engineer, how good he was, and how learned, and how, when he died, the whole country seemed to mourn as for a friend. He belonged to a great many learned societies, and was at the head of the State Department, entrusted with the care of the dikes and other defenses against the sea. There's no counting the improvements he made in dikes and sluices and water mills and all that kind of thing. We Hollanders, you know, consider our great engineers as the highest of public benefactors. Brunings died years ago. They've a monument to his memory in the Cathedral of Haarlem. I have seen his portrait, and I tell you, Ben, he was right noble-looking. No wonder the castle looks so stiff and proud. It is something to have given shelter to such a man. Yes, indeed, said Ben. I wonder, Van Monen, whether you or I will ever give any old building a right to feel so proud. Hi-ho! There's a great deal to be done yet in this world, and some of us, who are boys now, will have to do it. Look to your shoe latchet, Van. It's unfastened. End of chapter. Chapter 13 of Hans Brinker. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording is by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. Hans Brinker, or The Silver Skates, by Mary Mapes Dodge. Chapter 13. A Catastrophe. It was nearly 1 o'clock when Captain von Holp and his command entered the grand old city of Haarlem. They had skated nearly 17 miles since morning, and were still as fresh as young eagles. From the youngest, Ludwig von Holp, who was just 14, to the eldest, no less a personage than the captain himself, a veteran of 17, There was but one opinion, that this was the greatest frolic of their lives. To be sure, Jacob Poot had become rather short of breath during the last mile or two, and perhaps he felt ready for another nap, but there was enough jollity in him yet for a dozen. Even Carl Schummel, who had become very intimate with Ludwig during the excursion, forgot to be ill-natured. As for Peter, he was the happiest of the happy, and had sung and whistled so joyously while skating that the staidest passers-by had smiled as they listened. "Come, boys, it's nearly tiffin hour," he said as they neared a coffee-house on the main street. "We must have something more solid than the pretty maiden's gingerbread." And the captain plunged his hands into his pockets as if to say, "There's money enough here to feed an army." "Halloo!" cried Lambert. "What ails the man?" Peter, pale and staring, was clapping his hands upon his breast and sides. He looked like one suddenly becoming deranged. "He's sick!" cried Ben. "No, he's lost something," said Carl. Peter could only gasp. "The pocket-book with all our money in it. It's gone." For an instant all were too much startled to speak. Carl at last came out with a gruff, "No sense in letting one fellow have all the money. I said so from the first. Look in your other pocket." "I did. It isn't there." "Open your under-jacket." Peter obeyed mechanically. He even took off his hat and looked into it, then thrust his hand desperately into every pocket. "It's gone, boys," he said at last in a hopeless tone. "No tiffin for us, nor dinner either. What is to be done? We can't get on without money. If we were in Amsterdam I could get as much as we want, but there is not a man in Haarlem from whom I can borrow a stiver. Doesn't one of you know anyone here who would lend us a few guilders?" Each boy looked into 5 blank faces. Then something like a smile passed around the circle, but it got sadly knotted up when it reached Carl. "That wouldn't do," he said crossly. "I know some people here, rich ones, too, but father would flog me soundly if I borrowed a cent from anyone. He has 'An honest man need not borrow' written over the gateway of his summer house." "Humph!" responded Peter, not particularly admiring the sentiment just at that moment. The boys grew desperately hungry at once. "It wash my fault," said Jacob in a penitent tone to Ben. "I say first, petter all de boys put their purse into Van Hope's monish." "Nonsense, Jacob. You did it all for the best." Ben said this in such a sprightly tone that the 2 Van Holps and Carl felt sure that he had proposed a plan that would relieve the party at once. "What? What? Tell us, Van Monen," they cried. "He says it is not Jacob's fault that the money is lost, that he did it for the best when he proposed that Van Holp should put all of our money into his purse." "Is that all?" said Ludwig dismally. "He need not have made such a fuss in just saying that. How much money have we lost?" "Don't you remember?" said Peter. "We each put in exactly 10 guilders. The purse had 60 guilders in it. I am the stupidest fellow in the world. Little Schimmelpenninck would have made you a better captain. I could pommel myself for bringing such a disappointment upon you." "Do it, then," growled Carl. "Pooh!" he added. "We all know that it was an accident, but that doesn't help matters. We must have money, Van Holp, even if you have to sell your wonderful watch." "Sell my mother's birthday present? Never! I will sell my coat, my hat, anything but my watch." "Come, come," said Jacob pleasantly. "We are making too much of this affair. We can go home and start again in a day or 2. "You may be able to get another 10 guilder piece," said Carl, "but the rest of us will not find it so easy. If we go home, we stay home, you may depend." Our captain, whose good nature had not yet forsaken him for a moment, grew indignant. "Do you think that I will let you suffer for my carelessness?" he exclaimed.
I have 3 times 60 guilders in my strong box at home." "Oh, I beg your pardon," said Carl hastily, adding in a surlier tone, "Well, I see no better way than to go back hungry." "I see a better plan than that," said the captain. "What is it?" cried all the boys. "Why, to make the best of a bad business and go back pleasantly and like men," said Peter, looking so gallant and handsome as he turned his frank face and clear blue eyes upon them that they caught his spirit. "Ho for the captain!" they shouted. "Now, boys, we may as well make up our minds there's no place like Broek after all, and that we mean to be there in 2 hours. Is that agreed to?" "Agreed!" cried all as they ran to the canal. "On with your skates! Are you ready? Here, Jacob, let me help you. Now, 1, 2, 3, start!" And the boyish faces that left Haarlem at that signal were nearly as bright as those that had entered it with Captain Peter half an hour before. End of chapter.
Chapter 14 of Hans Brinker. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording is by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. Hans Brinker, or The Silver Skates, by Mary Mapes Dodge. Chapter 14. Hans.
"Dunder and Blixen!" cried Carl angrily, before the party had skated 20 yards from the city gates. "If here isn't that wooden skate ragamuffin in the patched leather breeches! That fellow is everywhere, confound him! We'll be lucky," he added, in as sneering a tone as he dared to assume, "if our captain doesn't order us to halt and shake hands with him."
"Your captain is a terrible fellow," said Peter pleasantly. "But this is a false alarm, Carl. I cannot spy your bugbear anywhere among the skaters. Ah, there he is. Why, what is the matter with the lad?" Poor Hans! His face was pale, his lips compressed. He skated like one under the effects of a fearful dream. Just as he was passing, Peter hailed him. "Good day, Hans Brinker." Hans's countenance brightened at once. "Ah, mynheer, is that you? It is well we meet."
"Just like his impertinence!"
hissed Carl Schummel, darting scornfully past his companions, who seemed inclined to linger with their captain. "I am glad to see you, Hans," responded Peter cheerfully. "But you look troubled. Can I serve you?" "I have a trouble, mynheer," answered Hans, casting down his eyes. Then, lifting them again with almost a happy expression, he added, "But it is Hans who can help Mynheer van Holp this time." "How?" asked Peter, making in his blunt Dutch way no attempt to conceal his surprise. "By giving you this, mynheer." And Hans held forth the missing purse. "Hurrah!" shouted the boys, taking their cold hands from their pockets to wave them joyfully in the air. But Peter said, "Thank you, Hans Brinker," in a tone that made Hans feel as if the king had knelt to him. The shout of the delighted boys had reached the muffled ears of the fine young gentleman who, under a full pressure of pent-up wrath, was skating toward Amsterdam. A Yankee boy would have wheeled about at once and hastened to satisfy his curiosity, but Carl only halted, and with his back toward his party, wondered what on earth had happened. There he stood, immovable, until, feeling sure that nothing but the prospect of something to eat could have made them hurrah so heartily, he turned and skated slowly towards his excited comrades. In the meantime Peter had drawn Hans aside from the rest. "How did you know it was my purse?" he asked. "You paid me 3 guilders yesterday, mynheer, for making the whitewood chain, telling me that I must buy skates." "Yes, I remember." "I saw your purse then. It was of yellow leather." "And where did you find it today?" I left my home this morning, mynheer, in great trouble, and as I skated, I took no heed until I stumbled against some lumber, and while I was rubbing my knee I saw your purse nearly hidden under a log." "That place! Ah, I remember now. Just as we were passing it, I pulled my tippet from my pocket, and probably flipped out the purse at the same time. It would have been gone but for you, Hans. Here," pouring out the contents, "you must give us the pleasure of dividing the money with you." "No, mynheer," answered Hans. He spoke quietly, without pretense or any grace of manner, but Peter, somehow, felt rebuked, and put the silver back without a word. "I like that boy, rich or poor," he thought to himself, then added aloud, "May I ask about this trouble of yours, Hans?" "Ah, mynheer, it is a sad case, but I have waited here too long. I am going to Leyden to see the great Dr. Boekman." "Dr. Boekman!" exclaimed Peter in astonishment. "Yes, mynheer, and I have not a moment to lose. Good day." "Stay, I am going that way. Come, my lads, shall we return to Haarlem?" "Yes," cried the boys eagerly, and off they started. "Now," said Peter, drawing near Hans, both skimming the ice so easily and lightly as they skated on together that they seemed scarcely conscious of moving, "we are going to stop at Leyden, and if you are going there only with the message to Dr. Boekman, cannot I do the errand for you? The boys may be too tired to skate so far today, but I will promise to see him early tomorrow if he is to be found in the city." "Ah, mynheer, that would be serving me indeed. It is not the distance I dread, but leaving my mother so long." "Is she ill?" "No, mynheer, it is the father. You may have heard it, how he has been without wit for many a year, ever since the great Schlossen mill was built, but his body has been well and strong. Last night the mother knelt upon the hearth to blow the peat. It is his only delight to sit and watch the live embers, and she will blow them into a blaze every hour of the day to please him. Before she could stir, he sprang upon her like a giant and held her close to the fire, all the time laughing and shaking his head. I was on the canal, but I heard the mother scream and ran to her. The father had never loosened his hold, and her gown was smoking. I tried to deaden the fire, but with one hand he pushed me off. There was no water in the cottage, or I could have done better, and all that time he laughed. Such a terrible laugh, mynheer, hardly a sound, but all in his face. I tried to pull her away, but that only made it worse. Then, it was dreadful, but could I see the mother burn? I beat him with a stool. He tossed me away. The gown was on fire. I would put it out. I can't remember well after that. I found myself upon the floor, and the mother was praying. It seemed to me that she was in a blaze, and all the while I could hear that laugh. Gretel flew to the closet, and filled a porringer with the food he liked, and put it upon the floor. Then, mynheer, he left the mother and crawled to it like a little child. She was not burned, only a part of her clothing. Ah, how kind she was to him all night, watching and tending him. He slept in a high fever, with his hands pressed to his head. The mother says he has done that so much of late, as though he felt pain there. Ah, mynheer, I did not mean to tell you. If the father was himself, he would not harm even a kitten." For a moment the two boys moved on in silence. "It is terrible," said Peter at last. "How is he today?" "Very sick, mynheer." "Why go for Dr. Boekman, Hans? There are others in Amsterdam who could help him, perhaps. Boekman is a famous man, sought only by the wealthiest, and they often wait upon him in vain." "He promised, mynheer, he promised me yesterday to come to the father in a week. But now that the change has come, we cannot wait. We think the poor father is dying. Oh, mynheer, you can plead with him to come quick. He will not wait a whole week, and our father dying, the good meester is so kind. So kind!
echoed Peter in astonishment. "Why, he is known as the crossest man in Holland." "He looks so because he has no fat, and his head is busy, but his heart is kind, I know. Tell the meester what I have told you, mynheer, and he will come." "I hope so, Hans, with all my heart. You are in haste to turn homeward, I see. Promise me that should you need a friend, you will go to my mother in Broek. Tell her I bade you see her. And, Hans Brinker, not as a reward, but as a gift, take a few of these guilders." Hans shook his head resolutely. "No, no, mynheer, I cannot take it. If I could find work in Broek or at the South Mill, I would be glad, but it is the same story everywhere. Wait until spring." "It is well you speak of it," said Peter eagerly, "for my father needs help at once. Your pretty chain pleased him much. He said, 'That boy has a clean cut. He would be good at carving.' There is to be a carved portal to our new summer house, and father will pay well for the job." "God is good!" cried Hans in sudden delight. "Oh, mynheer, that would be too much joy! I have never tried big work, but I can do it. I know I can." "Well, tell my father you are the Hans Brinker of whom I spoke. He will be glad to serve you." Hans stared in honest surprise. "Thank you, mynheer." "Now, captain," shouted Carl, anxious to appear as good-humored as possible, by way of atonement, "here we are in the midst of Haarlem, and no word from you yet. We await your orders, and we're as hungry as wolves." Peter made a cheerful answer, and turned hurriedly to Hans. "Come, get something to eat, and I will detain you no longer." What a quick, wistful look Hans threw upon him! Peter wondered that he had not noticed before that the poor boy was hungry. "Ah, mynheer, even now the mother may need me. The father may be worse. I must not wait. May God care for you." And nodding hastily, Hans turned his face homeward and was gone. "Come, boys," sighed Peter. "Now for our tiffin." End of chapter. Chapter 15 of Hans Brinker. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording is by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. Hans Brinker, or The Silver Skates, by Mary Mapes Dodge. Chapter 15. Homes. It must not be supposed that our young Dutchmen had already forgotten the great skating race which was to take place on the 20th. On the contrary, they had thought and spoken of it very often during the day. Even Ben, though he had felt more like a traveler than the rest, had never once, through all the sightseeing, lost a certain vision of silver skates which, for a week past, had haunted him night and day. Like a true John Bull, as Jacob had called him, he never doubted that his English fleetness, English strength, English everything, could at any time enable him, on the ice, to put all Holland to shame, and the rest of the world too, for that matter. Ben certainly was a superb skater. He had enjoyed not half the opportunities for practicing that had fallen to his new comrades, but he had improved his share to the utmost, and was, besides, so strong of frame, so supple of limb, in short, such a tight, trim, quick, graceful fellow in every way, that he had taken to skating as naturally as a chamois to leaping or an eagle to soaring. Only to the heavy heart of poor Hans had the vision of the silver skates failed to appear during that starry winter night and the brighter sunlit day. Even Gretel had seen them flitting before her as she sat beside her mother through those hours of weary watching, not as prizes to be won, but as treasures passing hopelessly beyond her reach. Richie, Hilda, and Katrinka, why, they had scarcely known any other thought than, the race, it will come off on the 20th. These three girls were friends.
Though of nearly the same age, talent, and station, they were as different as girls could be. Hilda van Gleck, as you already know, was a warm-hearted, noble girl of 14. Richie Korbes was beautiful to look upon, far more sparkling and pretty than Hilda, but not half so bright and sunny within. Clouds of pride, of discontent, and envy had already gathered in her heart and were growing bigger and darker every day. Of course, these often relieved themselves very much after the manner of other clouds. But who saw the storms and the weeping? Only her maid or her father, mother, and little brother, those who loved her better than all. Like other clouds, too, hers often took queer shapes, and what was really but mist and vapory fancy assumed the appearance of monster wrongs and mountains of difficulty. To her mind, the poor peasant girl Gretel was not a human being, a God-created creature like herself. She was only something that meant poverty, rags, and dirt. Such as Gretel had no right to feel, to hope. Above all, they should never cross the paths of their betters. That is, not in a disagreeable way. They could toil and labor for them at a respectful distance, even admire them if they would do it humbly, but nothing more. If they rebel, put them down. If they suffer, don't trouble me about it, was Richie's secret motto. And yet how witty she was, how tastefully she dressed, how charmingly she sang, how much feeling she displayed for pet kittens and rabbits, and how completely she could bewitch sensible, honest-minded lads like Lambert van Monen and Ludwig van Holp. Carl was too much like her within to be an earnest admirer, and perhaps he suspected the clouds. He, being deep and surly and always uncomfortably in earnest, of course preferred the lively Katrinka, whose nature was made of 100 tinkling bells. She was a coquette in her infancy, a coquette in her childhood, and now a coquette in her schooldays. Without a thought of harm, she coquetted with her studies, her duties, even her little troubles. She coquetted with her mother, her pet lamb, her baby brother, even with her own golden curls, tossing them back as if she despised them. Everyone liked her, but who could love her? She was never in earnest. A pleasant face, a pleasant heart, a pleasant manner, these satisfy for an hour. Poor happy Katrinka! She tinkled so merrily through their early days, but life is so apt to coquette with them in turn, to put all their sweet bells out of tune, or to silence them one by one. How different were the homes of these 3 girls from the tumbling old cottage where Gretel dwelt. Richie lived in a beautiful house near Amsterdam, where the carved sideboards were laden with services of silver and gold, and where silken tapestries hung in folds from ceiling to floor. Hilda's father owned the largest mansion in Broek. Its glittering roof of polished tiles and its boarded front, painted in half a dozen various colors, were the admiration of the neighborhood. Katrinka's home, not a mile distant, was the finest of Dutch country seats. The garden was so stiffly laid out in little paths and patches that the birds might have mistaken it for a great Chinese puzzle, with all the pieces spread out ready for use. But in summer it was beautiful. The flowers made the best of their stiff quarters, and when the gardener was not watching, glowed and bent about each other in the prettiest way imaginable. Such a tulip bed! Why, the Queen of the Fairies would never care for a grander city in which to hold her court. But Katrinka preferred the bed of pink and white hyacinths. She loved their freshness and fragrance, and the light-hearted way in which their bell-shaped blossoms swung in the breeze. Carl was both right and wrong when he said that Katrinka and Richie were furious at the very idea of the peasant Gretel joining in the race. He had heard Richie declare that it was disgraceful, shameful, too bad, which in Dutch, as in English, is generally the strongest expression an indignant girl can use, and he had seen Katrinka nod her pretty head and heard her sweetly echo, "Shameful, too bad," as nearly like Rychie as tinkling bells can be like the voice of real anger. This had satisfied him. He had never suspected that had Hilda, not Rychie, first talked with Katrinka upon the subject, the bells would have jingled as willing an echo. She would have said, "Certainly, let her join us," and would have skipped off thinking no more about it. But now Katrinka with sweet emphasis pronounced it a shame that a goose girl, a forlorn little creature like Gretel, should be allowed to spoil the race. Rychie Korbes, being rich and powerful, in a schoolgirl way, had other followers besides Katrinka who were induced to share her opinions because they were either too careless or too cowardly to think for themselves. Poor little Gretel! Her home was sad and dark enough now. Raff Brinker lay moaning upon his rough bed, and his vrouw, forgetting and forgiving everything, bathed his forehead, his lips, weeping and praying that he might not die. Hans, as we know, had started in desperation for Leyden to search for Dr. Boekman and induce him, if possible, to come to their father at once. Gretel, filled with a strange dread, had done the work as well as she could, wiped the rough brick floor, brought peat to build up the slow fire, and melted ice for her mother's use. This accomplished, she seated herself upon a low stool near the bed and begged her mother to try to sleep a while. "You are so tired," she whispered. "Not once have you closed your eyes since that dreadful hour last night. See, I have straightened the willow bed in the corner and spread everything soft upon it I could find, so that the mother might lie in comfort. Here is your jacket. Take off that pretty dress. I'll fold it away very carefully and put it in the big chest before you go to sleep." Dame Brinker shook her head without turning her eyes from her husband's face. "I can watch, Mother," urged Gretel, "and I'll wake you every time the father stirs. You are so pale, and your eyes are so red. Oh, Mother, do!" The child pleaded in vain. Dame Brinker would not leave her post. Gretel looked at her in troubled silence, wondering whether it was very wicked to care more for one parent than for the other, and sure, yes, quite sure, that she dreaded her father, while she clung to her mother with a love that was almost idolatry. Hans loves the father so well, she thought. Why cannot I? Yet I could not help crying when I saw his hand bleed that day, last month, when he snatched the knife. And now, when he moans, how I ache all over. Perhaps I love him after all, and God will see that I am not such a bad, wicked girl as I thought. Yes, I love the poor father, almost as Hans does. Not quite, for Hans is stronger and does not fear him. Oh, will that moaning go on forever and ever? Poor mother, how patient she is. She never pouts, as I do, about the money that went away so strangely. If he only could for one instant open his eyes and look at us, as Hans does, and tell us where Mother's guilders went, I would not care for the rest. Yes, I would care. I don't want the poor father to die, to be all blue and cold like Annie Bowman's little sister. I know I don't. Dear God, I don't want father to die. Her thoughts merged into a prayer. When it ended, the poor child scarcely knew. Soon she found herself watching a little pulse of light at the side of the fire, beating faintly but steadily, showing that somewhere in the dark pile there was warmth and light that would overspread it at last. A large earthen cup filled with burning peat stood near the bedside. Gretel had placed it there to stop the father's shivering, she said. She watched it as it sent a glow around the mother's form, tipping her faded skirt with light and shedding a sort of newness over the threadbare bodice. It was a relief to Gretel to see the lines in that weary face soften as the firelight flickered gently across it. Next she counted the window panes, broken and patched as they were, and finally, after tracing every crack and seam in the walls, fixed her gaze upon a carved shelf made by Hans. The shelf hung as high as Gretel could reach. It held a large leather-covered Bible with brass clasps, a wedding present to Dame Brinker from the family at Heidelberg. Ah, how handy Hans is! If he were here, he could turn the father some way so the moans would stop. Dear, dear, if this sickness lasts, we shall never skate any more. I must send my new skates back to the beautiful lady. Hans and I will not see the race. And Gretel's eyes, that had been dry before, grew full of tears. Never cry, child, said her mother soothingly. This sickness may not be as bad as we think. The father has lain this way before. Gretel sobbed now. Oh, mother, it is not that alone. You do not know all. I am very, very bad and wicked. You, Gretel, you so patient and good. And a bright, puzzled look beamed for an instant upon the child. Hush, lovey, you'll wake him. Gretel hid her face in her mother's lap and tried not to cry. Her little hand, so thin and brown, lay in the coarse palm of her mother's, creased with many a hard day's work. Richie would have shuddered to touch either, yet they pressed warmly upon each other. Soon Gretel looked up with that dull, homely look which, they say, poor children in shanties are apt to have, and said in a trembling voice, The father tried to burn you. He did. I saw him, and he was laughing. Hush, child. The mother's words came so suddenly and sharply that Raff Brinker, dead as he was to all that was passing around him, twitched slightly upon the bed. Gretel said no more but plucked drearily at the jagged edge of a hole in her mother's holiday gown. It had been burned there. Well for Dame Brinker that the gown was woolen. End of chapter. Chapter 16 of Hans Brinker. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording is by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. Hans Brinker, or The Silver Skates, by Mary Mapes Dodge. Chapter 16. Haarlem, the Boys Hear Voices. Refreshed and rested, our boys came forth from the coffee house just as the big clock in the square, after the manner of certain Holland timekeepers, was striking 2 with its half-hour bell for 2:30. The captain was absorbed in thought. At first, for Hans Brinker's sad story still echoed in his ears. Not until Ludwig rebuked him with a laughing, "Wake up, grandfather," did he reassume his position as gallant boy leader of his band. This way, young gentlemen. They were walking through the city, not on a curbed sidewalk, for such a thing is rarely to be found in Holland, but on the brick pavement that lay on the borders of the cobblestone carriageway without breaking its level expanse. Haarlem, like Amsterdam, was gayer than usual, in honor of St. Nicholas. A strange figure was approaching them. It was a small man dressed in black, with a short cloak. He wore a wig and a cocked hat from which a long crape streamer was flying. "Who comes here?" cried Ben. "What a queer-looking object!" "That's the Brinker," said Lambert. "Someone is dead." "Is that the way men dress in mourning in this country?" "Oh, no. The Aanspreeker attends funerals, and it is his business, when anyone dies, to notify all the friends and relatives." "What a strange custom!" "Well," said Lambert, "we needn't feel very badly about this particular death, for I see another man has lately been born to the world to fill up the vacant place." Ben stared. "How do you know that?" "Don't you see that pretty red pincushion hanging on yonder door?" asked Lambert in return. "Yes." "Well, that's a boy."
A boy? What do you mean?"
"I mean that here in Haarlem, whenever a boy is born, the parents have a red pincushion put out at the door. If our young friend had been a girl instead of a boy, the cushion would have been white. In some places they have much more fanciful affairs, all trimmed with lace, and even among the very poorest houses you will see a bit of ribbon or even a string tied on the door latch." "Look!" screamed Ben. "There is a white cushion at the door of that double-joined house with the funny roof."
"I don't see any house with a funny roof."
"Oh, of course not," said Ben. "I forgot you're a native, but all the roofs are queer to me, for that matter. I mean the house next to that green building." "True enough, there's a girl. I tell you what, Captain," called out Lambert, slipping easily into Dutch. "We must get out of this street as soon as possible. It's full of babies. They'll set up a squall in a moment." The captain laughed. "I shall take you to hear better music than that," he said. "We are just in time to hear the organ of Saint Bavon. The church is open today." "What? The great Haarlem organ?" asked Ben. "That will be a treat indeed. I have often read of it, with its tremendous pipes, and its vox humana, which is an organ stop which produces an effect resembling the human voice. That sounds like a giant singing." "The same," answered Lambert van Mounen. Peter was right. The church was open, though not for religious services. Someone was playing upon the organ. As the boys entered, a swell of sound rushed forth to meet them. It seemed to bear them, one by one, into the shadows of the building. Louder and louder it grew until it became like the din and roar of some mighty tempest, or like the ocean surging upon the shore. In the midst of the tumult a tinkling bell was heard. Another answered, then another, and the storm paused as if to listen. The bells grew bolder. They rang out loud and clear. Other deep-toned bells joined in. They were tolling in solemn concert. Ding dong, ding dong. The storm broke forth with redoubled fury, gathering its distant thunder. The boys looked at each other but did not speak. It was growing serious. What was that? Who screamed? What screamed? That terrible musical scream? Was it man or demon? Or was it some monster shut up behind that carved brass frame, behind those great silver columns? Some despairing monster begging, screaming for freedom. It was the vox humana. At last an answer came, soft, tender, loving, like a mother's song. The storm grew silent. Hidden birds sprang forth, filling the air with glad, ecstatic music, rising higher and higher until the last faint note was lost in the distance. The vox humana was stilled, but in the glorious hymn of thanksgiving that now arose, one could almost hear the throbbing of a human heart. What did it mean? That man's imploring cry should in time be met with a deep content? That gratitude would give us freedom? To Peter and Ben it seemed that the angels were singing. Their eyes grew dim, and their souls dizzy with a strange joy. At last, as if borne upwards by invisible hands, they were floating away on the music, all fatigue forgotten, and with no wish but to hear forever those beautiful sounds. When suddenly Van Holp's sleeve was pulled impatiently, and a gruff voice beside him asked, "How long are you going to stay here, Captain? Blinking at the ceiling like a sick rabbit. It's high time we started." "Hush," whispered Peter, only half aroused. "Come, man, let's go," said Carl, giving the sleeve a second pull. Peter turned reluctantly. He would not detain the boys against their will. All but Ben were casting rather reproachful glances upon him. "Well, boys," he whispered, "we will go. Softly now." "That's the greatest thing I've seen or heard since I've been in Holland," cried Ben enthusiastically, as soon as they reached the open air. "It's glorious." Ludwig and Carl laughed slyly at the English boy's vartaal, or gibberish. Jacob yawned, and Peter gave Ben a look that made him instantly feel that he and Peter were not so very different, after all, though one hailed from Holland and the other from England. And Lambert, the interpreter, responded with a brisk, "You may well say so. I believe there are one or two organs nowadays that are said to be as fine, but for years and years this organ of St. Bavon was the grandest in the world." "Do you know how large it is?" asked Ben. "I noticed that the church itself was prodigiously high, and that the organ filled the end of the great aisle almost from floor to roof." "That's true," said Lambert. "And how superb the pipes looked, just like grand columns of silver. They're only for show, you know. The real pipes are behind them, some big enough for a man to crawl through, and some smaller than a baby's whistle. Well, sir, for size, the church is higher than Westminster Abbey, to begin with, and, as you say, the organ makes a tremendous show even then. Father told me last night that it is 108 feet high, 50 feet wide, and has over 5,000 pipes. It has 64 stops, if you know what they are, I don't, and 3 keyboards." "Good for you," said Ben. "You have a fine memory. My head is a perfect colander for figures. They slip through as fast as they're poured in. But other facts and historical events stay behind. That's some consolation." "There we differ," returned Van Mounen. "I'm great on names and figures, but history, take it all together, seems to me to be the most hopeless kind of jumble." Meantime, Carl and Ludwig were having a discussion concerning some square wooden monuments they had observed in the interior of the church. Ludwig declared that each bore the name of the person buried beneath, and Carl insisted that they had no names but only the heraldic arms of the deceased painted on a black ground, with the date of the death in gilt letters. "I ought to know," said Carl, "for I walked across to the east side, to look for the cannonball Mother told me was embedded there. It was fired into the church, in the year 1500 and something, by those rascally Spaniards, while the services were going on. There it was in the wall, sure enough, and while I was walking back I noticed the monuments. I tell you, they haven't the sign of a name on them." "Ask Peter," said Ludwig, only half convinced. "Carl is right," replied Peter, who, though conversing with Jacob, had overheard their dispute. "Well, Jacob, as I was saying, Handel, the great composer, chanced to visit Haarlem, and of course he at once hunted up this famous organ. He gained admittance and was playing upon it with all his might, when the regular organist chanced to enter the building. The man stood awestruck. He was a good player himself, but he had never heard such music before. 'Who is there?' he cried. 'If it is not an angel or the devil, it must be Handel.' When he discovered that it was the great musician, he was still more mystified. 'But how is this?' he said. 'You have done impossible things. No 10 fingers on earth can play the passages you have given. Human fingers couldn't control all the keys and stops.' 'I know it,' said Handel coolly, 'and for that reason I was forced to strike some notes with the end of my nose.' Donder! Just think how the old organist must have stared." "Hey, what?" exclaimed Jacob, startled when Peter's animated voice suddenly became silent. "Haven't you heard me, you rascal?" was the indignant rejoinder. "Oh, yes, no. The fact is, I heard you at first. I'm awake now, but I do believe I've been walking beside you half asleep," stammered Jacob, with such a doleful, bewildered look on his face that Peter could not help laughing. End of chapter. Chapter 17 of Hans Brinker. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org.
This recording is by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. Hans Brinker, or The Silver Skates, by Mary Mapes Dodge. Chapter 17. The Man with Four Heads. After leaving the church, the boys stopped nearby in the open marketplace to look at the bronze statue of Laurens Janszoon Coster, who is believed by the Dutch to have been the inventor of printing. This is disputed by those who award the same honor to Johannes Gutenberg of Mayence, whence many maintain that Faustus, a servant of Coster, stole his master's wooden types on a Christmas Eve, when the latter was at church, and fled with his booty and his secret to Mayence. Coster was a native of Haarlem, and the Hollanders are naturally anxious to secure the credit of the invention for their illustrious townsman. Certain it is that the first book he printed is kept by the city in a silver case wrapped in silk, and is shown with great caution as a precious relic. It is said that he first conceived the idea of printing from cutting his name upon the bark of a tree, and afterward pressing a piece of paper upon the characters. Of course, Lambert and his English friend fully discussed this subject. They also had a rather warm argument concerning another invention. Lambert declared that the honor of giving both the telescope and the microscope to the world lay between Metius and Jansen, both Hollanders, while Ben as stoutly insisted that Roger Bacon, an English monk of the 13th century, wrote out the whole thing, sir, perfect descriptions of microscopes and telescopes too, long before either of those other fellows was born. On one subject, however, they both agreed, that the art of curing and pickling herrings was discovered by William Berkels of Holland, and that the country did perfectly right in honoring him as a national benefactor, for its wealth and importance had been in a great measure due to its herring trade. "It is astonishing," said Ben, "in what prodigious quantities those fish are found. I don't know how it is here, but on the coast of England, off Yarmouth, the herring shoals have been known to be 6 and 7 feet deep with fish." "That is prodigious indeed," said Lambert. "But you know your herring is derived from the German Heer, an army, on account of a way the fish have of coming in large numbers." Soon afterward, while passing a cobbler's shop, Ben exclaimed, "Halloo! Lambert, here is the name of one of your greatest men over a cobbler's stall. Boerhaave. If it were only Herman Boerhaave instead of Hendrik, it would be complete." Lambert knit his brows reflectively as he replied, "Boerhaave, Boerhaave. The name is perfectly familiar. I remember, too, that he was born in 1668, but the rest is all gone as usual. There have been so many famous Hollanders, you see, that it is impossible for a fellow to know them all. What was he? Did he have 2 heads? Or was he one of your great natural swimmers like Marco Polo?" "He had 4 heads," answered Ben, laughing, "for he was a great physician, naturalist, botanist, and chemist. I am full of him just now, for I read his life a few weeks ago." "Pour out a little, then," said Lambert. "Only walk faster, or we shall lose sight of the other boys." "Well," resumed Ben, quickening his pace and looking with great interest at everything going on in the crowded street, "this Dr. Boerhaave was a great aanspooker." "A great what?" roared Lambert. "Oh, I beg pardon. I was thinking of that man over there with the cocked hat. He's an aanspooker, isn't he?" "Yes, he's an aanspreker, if that's what you mean to say. But what about your friend with the 4 heads?" "Well, as I was going to say, the doctor was left a penniless orphan at 16, without education or friends." "Jolly beginning," interposed Lambert. "Now, don't interrupt. He was a poor friendless orphan at 16, but he was so persevering and industrious, so determined to gain knowledge, that he made his way, and in time became one of the most learned men of Europe. All the... What is that?" "Where? What do you mean?" "Why, that paper on the door opposite.
Don't you see? 2 or 3 persons are reading it. I have noticed several of these papers since I've been here." "Oh, that's only a health bulletin. Somebody in the house is ill, and to prevent a steady knocking at the door, the family write an account of the patient's condition on a placard and hang it outside the door, for the benefit of inquiring friends. A very sensible custom, I'm sure. Nothing strange about it that I can see. Go on, please. You said, 'all the—' and there you left me hanging." "I was going to say," resumed Ben, "that all the— How comically persons do dress here, to be sure! Just look at those men and women with their sugar-loaf hats! And see this woman ahead of us with a straw bonnet like a scoop shovel tapering to a point in the back. Did you ever see anything so funny? And those tremendous wooden shoes, too. I declare, she's a beauty." "Oh, they are only back country folk," said Lambert rather impatiently. "You might as well let old Boerhaave drop, or else shut your eyes." "Ha, ha, ha! Well, I was going to say, all the big men of his day sought out this great professor. Even Peter the Great, when he came over to Holland from Russia to learn shipbuilding, attended his lectures regularly. By that time Boerhaave was professor of medicine and chemistry and botany in the university at Leyden. He had grown to be very wealthy as a practicing physician, but he used to say that the poor were his best patients because God would be their paymaster. All Europe learned to love and honor him. In short, he became so famous that a certain mandarin of China addressed a letter to 'the illustrious Boerhaave, physician in Europe,' and the letter found its way to him without any difficulty." "My goodness, that is what I call being a public character. The boys have stopped. How now, Captain van Holp, where next?" "We propose to move on," said Van Holp. "There is nothing to see at this season in the Bosch. The Bosch is a noble wood, Benjamin, a grand park where they have most magnificent trees, protected by law. Do you understand?" "Ja," nodded Ben as the captain proceeded. "Unless you all desire to visit the Museum of Natural History, we may go on the Grand Canal again. If we had more time, it would be pleasant to take Benjamin up the Blue Stairs." "What are the Blue Stairs, Lambert?" asked Ben. "They are the highest point of the dunes. You have a grand view of the ocean from there, besides a fine chance to see how wonderful these dunes are. One can hardly believe that the wind could ever heap up sand in so remarkable a way. But we have to go through Bloemendaal to get there, not a very pretty village, and some distance from here. What do you say?" "Oh, I'm ready for anything. For my part, I would rather steer direct for Leyden, but we'll do as the captain says. Hey, Jacob?"
"Ja, dat is goed,"
said Jacob, who felt decidedly more like taking a nap than ascending the Blue Stairs. The captain was in favor of going to Leyden. "It's 4 long miles from here. Full 16 of your English miles, Benjamin. We have no time to lose if you wish to reach there before midnight. Decide quickly, boys. Blue Stairs or Leyden?" "Leyden!" they answered, and were out of Haarlem in a twinkling, admiring the lofty, tower-like windmills and pretty country seats as they left the city behind them. "If you really wish to see Haarlem," said Lambert to Ben, after they had skated a while in silence, "you should visit it in summer. It is the greatest place in the world for beautiful flowers. The walks around the city are superb, and the wood, with its miles of noble elms, all in full feather, is something to remember. You need not smile, old fellow, at my saying full feather. I was thinking of waving plumes and got my words mixed up a little. But a Dutch elm beats everything. It is the noblest tree on earth, Ben, if you except the English oak." "Aye," said Ben solemnly, "if you except the English oak." And for some moments he could scarcely see the canal because Robbie and Jenny kept bobbing in the air before his eyes. End of chapter. Chapter 18 of Hans Brinker. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording is by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. Hans Brinker, or The Silver Skates, by Mary Mapes Dodge. Chapter 18, Friends in Need. In the meantime, the other boys were listening to Peter's account of an incident which had occurred long ago, Sir Thomas Carr's tour through Holland. In a part of the city where stood an ancient castle, whose lord had tyrannized over the burghers of the town to such an extent that they surrounded his castle and laid siege to it. Just at the last extremity, when the haughty lord felt that he could hold out no longer and was prepared to sell his life as dearly as possible, his lady appeared on the ramparts and offered to surrender everything, provided she was permitted to bring out and retain as much of her most precious household goods as she could carry upon her back. The promise was given, and the lady came forth from the gateway, bearing her husband upon her shoulders. The burghers' pledge preserved him from the fury of the troops, but left them free to wreak their vengeance upon the castle. "Do you believe that story, Captain Peter?" asked Carl in an incredulous tone. "Of course I do. It is historical. Why should I doubt it?" "Simply because no woman could do it, and if she could, she wouldn't. That is my opinion." "And I believe that there are many who would. That is, to save those they really cared for," said Ludwig. Jacob, who in spite of his fat and sleepiness was of rather a sentimental turn, had listened with deep interest. "That is right, little fellow," he said, nodding his head approvingly. "I believe every word of it. I shall never marry a woman who would not be glad to do as much for me." "Heaven help her!" cried Carl, turning to gaze at the speaker. "Why, Poot, 3 men couldn't do it." "Perhaps not," said Jacob quietly, feeling that he had asked rather too much of the future Mrs. Poot. "But she must be willing, that is all." "Aye," responded Peter's cheery voice. "Willing heart makes nimble foot, and who knows but it may make strong arms also." "Pete," asked Ludwig, changing the subject, "did you tell me last night that the painter Wouwerman was born in Haarlem?" "Yes, and Jacob Ruysdael and Berchem too. I like Berchem as he was always good-natured. They say he always sang while he painted, and though he died nearly 200 years ago, there are traditions still afloat concerning his pleasant laugh. He was a great painter, and he had a wife as cross as Xantippe." "They balanced each other finely," said Ludwig. "He was kind, and she was cross. But, Peter, before I forget it, wasn't that picture of St. Hubert and the horse painted by Wouwerman? You remember? Father showed us an engraving from it last night." "Yes, indeed. There is a story connected with that picture." "Tell us!" cried 2 or 3, drawing closer to Peter as they skated on. "Wouwerman," began the captain oratorically, "was born in 1620, just 4 years before Berchem. He was a master of his art and especially excelled in painting horses. Strange as it may seem, people were so long finding out his merits that, even after he had arrived at the height of his excellence, he was obliged to sell his pictures for very paltry prices. The poor artist became completely discouraged, and worst of all, was over head and ears in debt. One day he was talking over his troubles with his father confessor, who was one of the few who recognized his genius. The priest determined to assist him, and accordingly lent him 600 guilders, advising him at the same time to demand a better price for his pictures. Wouwerman did so, and in the meantime paid his debts. Matters brightened with him at once. Everybody appreciated the great artist who painted such costly pictures. He grew rich. The 600 guilders were returned, and in gratitude Wouwerman sent also a work which he had painted, representing his benefactor as St. Hubert kneeling before his horse. The very picture, Ludwig, of which we were speaking last night." "So, so!" exclaimed Ludwig with deep interest. "I must take another look at the engraving as soon as we get home." At that same hour, while Ben was skating with his companions beside the Holland dike, Robbie and Jenny stood in their pretty English schoolhouse, ready to join in the duties of their reading class. "Commence, Master Robert Dobbs," said the teacher. "Page 242. Now, sir, mind every stop." And Robbie, in a quick childish voice, roared forth at schoolroom pitch, "Lesson 62, The Hero of Haarlem. Many years ago there lived in Haarlem, one of the principal cities of Holland, a sunny-haired boy of gentle disposition. His father was a sluicer, that is, a man whose business it was to open and close the sluices, or large oaken gates, that are placed at regular distances across the entrances of the canals, to regulate the amount of water that shall flow into them. The sluicer raises the gates more or less according to the quantity of water required, and closes them carefully at night, in order to avoid all possible danger of an oversupply running into the canal, or the water would soon overflow it and inundate the surrounding country. As a great portion of Holland is lower than the level of the sea, the waters are kept from flooding the land only by means of strong dikes, or barriers, and by means of these sluices, which are often strained to the utmost by the pressure of the rising tides. Even the little children in Holland know that constant watchfulness is required to keep the rivers and ocean from overwhelming the country, and that a moment's neglect of the sluicer's duty may bring ruin and death to all." "Very good," said the teacher. "Now, Susan."
"One lovely autumn afternoon, when the boy was about 8 years old, he obtained his parents' consent to carry some cakes to a blind man who lived out in the country, on the other side of the dike. The little fellow started on his errand with a light heart, and having spent an hour with his grateful old friend, he bade him farewell and started on his homeward walk. Trudging stoutly along the canal, he noticed how the autumn rains had swollen the waters. Even while humming his careless, childish song, he thought of his father's brave old gates, and felt glad of their strength, for, thought he, if they gave way, where would father and mother be? These pretty fields would all be covered with the angry waters. Father always calls them the angry waters. I suppose he thinks they are mad at him for keeping them out so long. And with these thoughts just flitting across his brain, the little fellow stooped to pick the pretty flowers that grew along his way. Sometimes he stopped to throw some feathery seed ball in the air, and watch it as it floated away. Sometimes he listened to the stealthy rustling of a rabbit, speeding through the grass. But oftener he smiled as he recalled the happy light he had seen arise on the weary, listening face of his blind old friend.
"Now, Henry," said the teacher, nodding to the next little reader.
Suddenly the boy looked around him in dismay. He had not noticed that the sun was setting. Now he saw that his long shadow on the grass had vanished. It was growing dark. He was still some distance from home, and in a lonely ravine, where even the blue flowers had turned to gray. He quickened his footsteps, and, with a beating heart, recalled many a nursery tale of children's belated and dreary forest. Just as he was bracing himself for a run, he was startled by the sound of trickling water. Whence did it come? He looked up and saw a small hole in the dike, through which a tiny stream was flowing. Any child in Holland will shudder at the thought of a leak in the dike. The boy understood the danger at a glance. That little hole, if the water were allowed to trickle through, would soon be a large one, and a terrible inundation would be the result. Quick as a flash he saw his duty. Throwing away his flowers, the boy clambered up the heights until he reached the hole. His chubby little finger was thrust in almost before he knew it. The flowing was stopped. Ah, he thought, with a chuckle of boyish delight, the angry waters must stay back now.
Haarlem shall not be drowned while I am here." This was all very well at first, but the night was falling rapidly. Chill vapors filled the air. Our little hero began to tremble with cold and dread. He shouted loudly. He screamed, "Come here! Come here!" But no one came. The cold grew more intense. A numbness, commencing in the tired little finger, crept over his hand and arm, and soon his whole body was filled with pain. He shouted again, "Will no one come? Mother, mother!" Alas, his mother, good, practical soul, had already locked the doors and had fully resolved to scold him on the morrow for spending the night with blind Jansen without her permission. He tried to whistle. Perhaps some straggling boy might heed the signal, but his teeth chattered so, it was impossible. Then he called on God for help, and the answer came, through a holy resolution, "I will stay here till morning." "Now, Jenny Dobbs," said the teacher. Jenny's eyes were glistening, but she took a long breath and commenced.
The midnight moon looked down upon that small, solitary form, sitting upon a stone, halfway up the dike. His head was bent, but he was not asleep, for every now and then one restless hand rubbed feebly the outstretched arm that seemed fastened to the dike, and often the pale, tearful face turned quickly at some real or fancied sounds. How can we know the sufferings of that long and fearful watch? What falterings of purpose, what childish terrors came over the boy as he thought of the warm little bed at home, of his parents, his brothers and sisters, then looked into the cold, dreary night. If he drew away that tiny finger, the angry waters, grown angrier still, would rush forth, and never stop until they had swept over the town. No, he would hold it there till daylight, if he lived. He was not very sure of living. What did this strange buzzing mean? And then the knives that seemed pricking and piercing him from head to foot? He was not certain now that he could draw his finger away, even if he wished to. At daybreak a clergyman, returning from the bedside of a sick parishioner, thought he heard groans as he walked along on the top of the dike. Bending, he saw, far down on the side, a child apparently writhing with pain. "In the name of wonder, boy," he exclaimed, "what are you doing there?" "I am keeping the water from running out," was the simple answer of the little hero. "Tell them to come quick." It is needless to add that they did come quickly, and that
"Jenny Dobbs," said the teacher, rather impatiently, "if you cannot control your feelings so as to read distinctly, we will wait until you recover yourself."
"Yes, sir,"
said Jenny, quite startled. It was strange, but at that very moment Ben, far over the sea, was saying to Lambert, "The noble little fellow! I have frequently met with an account of the incident, but I never knew, till now, that it was really true." "True? Of course it is," said Lambert. "I have given you the story just as Mother told it to me, years ago. Why, there is not a child in Holland who does not know it. And, Ben, you may not think so, but that little boy represents the spirit of the whole country. Not a leak can show itself anywhere, either in its politics, honor, or public safety, that a million fingers are not ready to stop it at any cost." "Whew!" cried Master Ben. "Big talkin' that." "It's true talk anyway," rejoined Lambert, so very quietly that Ben wisely resolved to make no further comment. End of chapter. Chapter 19 of Hans Brinker. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org.
This recording is by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. Hans Brinker, or The Silver Skates, by Mary Mapes Dodge. Chapter 19, On the Canal. The skating season had commenced unusually early. Our boys were by no means alone upon the ice. The afternoon was so fine that men, women, and children, bent upon enjoying the holiday, had flocked to the Grand Canal from far and near. St. Nicholas had evidently remembered the favorite pastime. Shining new skates were everywhere to be seen. Whole families were skimming their way to Haarlem or Leyden or the neighboring villages. The ice seemed fairly alive. Men noticed the erect, easy carriage of women, and their picturesque variety of costume. There were the latest fashions, fresh from Paris, floating past dingy, moth-eaten garments that had seen service through 2 generations. Coal-scuttled bonnets perched over freckled faces bright with holiday smiles. Stiff muslin capes with wings at the sides, flapping beside cheeks rosy with health and contentment. Furs, too, encircling the whitest of throats, and scanty garments fluttering below faces ruddy with exercise. In short, every quaint and comical mixture of dry goods and flesh that Holland could furnish seemed sent to enliven the scene. There were belles from Leyden, and fishwives from the border villages, cheese women from Gouda, and prim matrons from beautiful country seats on the Haarlemmer Meer. Gray-headed skaters were constantly to be seen, wrinkled old women with baskets upon their heads, and plump little toddlers on skates, clutching at their mothers' gowns. Some women carried their babies upon their backs, firmly secured with a bright shawl. The effect was pretty and graceful as they darted by or sailed slowly past, now nodding to an acquaintance, now chirruping and throwing soft baby talk to the muffled little ones they carried. Boys and girls were chasing each other and hiding behind the one-horse sleds that, loaded high with peat or timber, pursued their cautious way along the track marked out as safe. Beautiful, queenly women were there, enjoyment sparkling in their quiet eyes. Sometimes a long file of young men, each grasping the coat of the one before him, flew by with electric speed, and sometimes the ice squeaked under the chair of some gorgeous old dowager or rich burgomaster's lady, who, very red in the nose and sharp in the eyes, looked like a scare-thaw invented by old Father Winter for the protection of his skating grounds. The chair would be heavy with foot-stoves and cushions, to say nothing of the old lady. Mounted upon shining runners, it slid along, pushed by the sleepiest of servants, who, looking neither to the right nor the left, bent himself to his task, while she cast direful glances upon the screaming little rowdies who invariably acted as bodyguard. As for the men, they were pictures of placid enjoyment. Some were attired in ordinary citizen's dress, but many looked odd enough with their short woolen coats, wide breeches, and big silver buckles. These seemed to Ben like little boys who had, by a miracle, sprung suddenly into manhood and were forced to wear garments that their astonished mothers had altered in a hurry. He noticed, too, that nearly all the men had pipes as they passed him, whizzing and smoking like so many locomotives. There was every variety of pipes, from those of common clay to the most expensive meerschaums mounted in silver and gold. Some were carved into extraordinary and fantastic shapes, representing birds, flowers, heads, bugs, and dozens of other things. Some resembled the Dutchman's pipe that grows in our American woods. Some were red, and many were of a pure snowy white, but the most respectable were those which were ripening into a shaded brown. The deeper and richer the brown, of course, the more honored the pipe, for it was proof that the owner, if honestly shading it, was deliberately devoting his manhood to the effort. What pipe would not be proud to be the object of such a sacrifice? For a while Ben skated on in silence. There was so much to engage his attention that he almost forgot his companions. Part of the time he had been watching the ice-boats as they flew over the great Haarlemmer Meer, or lake, the frozen surface of which was now plainly visible from the canal. These boats had very large sails, much larger in proportion than those of ordinary vessels, and were set upon a triangular frame furnished with an iron runner at each corner, the widest part of the triangle crossing the bow, and its point stretching beyond the stem. They had rudders for guiding, and brakes for arresting their progress, and were of all sizes and kinds, from small, rough affairs managed by a boy, to large and beautiful ones filled with gay pleasure parties and manned by competent sailors, who, smoking their stumpy pipes, reefed and tacked and steered with great solemnity and precision. Some of the boats were painted and gilded in gaudy style and flaunted gray pennons from their mastheads. Others, white as snow, with every spotless sail rounded by the wind, looked like swans borne onward by a resistless current. It seemed to Ben, as, following his fancy, he watched one of these in the distance, that he could almost hear its helpless, terrified cry, but he soon found that the sound arose from a nearer and less romantic cause, from an ice-boat not 50 yards from him, using its brakes to avoid a collision with a peat sled. It was a rare thing for these boats to be upon the canal, and their appearance generally caused no little excitement among skaters, especially among the timid. But today every ice-boat in the country seemed to float, or rather a slide, and the canal had its full share. Ben, though delighted at the sight, was often startled at the swift approach of the resistless, high-winged things threatening to dart in any and every possible direction. It required all his energies to keep out of the way of the passers-by, and to prevent these screaming little urchins from upsetting him with their sleds. Once he halted to watch some boys who were making a hole in the ice preparatory to using their fishing spears. Just as he concluded to start again, he found himself suddenly bumped into an old lady's lap. Her push-chair had come upon him from the rear. The old lady screamed. The servant who was propelling her gave a warning hiss. In another instant Ben found himself apologizing to empty air. The indignant old lady was far ahead. This was a slight mishap compared with one that now threatened him. A huge ice-boat under full sail came tearing down the canal, almost paralyzing Ben with the thought of instant destruction. It was close upon him. He saw its gilded prow, heard the skipper, a master of a small trading vessel, a pleasure boat or ice-boat, shout, felt the great boom fairly whiz over his head, was blind, deaf, and dumb all in an instant, then opened his eyes to find himself spinning some yards behind its great skate-like rudder. It had passed within an inch of his shoulder, but he was safe. Safe to see England again, safe to kiss the dear faces that for an instant had flashed before him one by one. Father, Mother, Robbie, and Jenny. That great boom had dashed their images into his very soul. He knew now how much he loved them. Perhaps this knowledge made him face complacently the scowls of those on the canal, who seemed to feel that a boy in danger was necessarily a bad boy, needing instant reprimand. Lambert chided him roundly. "I thought it was all over with you, you careless fellow. Why don't you look where you're going? Not content with sitting on all the old ladies' laps, you must make a juggernaut of every ice-boat that comes along. We shall have to hand you over to the aanspreekers yet, if you don't look out." "Please don't," said Ben with mock humility. Then, seeing how pale Lambert's lips were, he added in a low tone, "I do believe I thought more in that one moment, Van Monen, than in all the rest of my past life." There was no reply, and, for a while, the two boys skated on in silence. Soon a faint sound of distant bells reached their ears. "Hark!" said Ben. "What is that?" "The carillons," replied Lambert. "They are trying the bells in the chapel of yonder village. Ah, Ben, you should hear the chimes of the new church at Delft. They are superb. Nearly 500 sweet-toned bells, and one of the best carillonneurs of Holland to play upon them. Hard work, though. They say the fellow often has to go to bed from positive exhaustion after his performances. You see, the bells are attached to a kind of keyboard, something like they have on pianofortes. There is also a set of pedals for the feet. When a brisk tune is going on, the player looks like a kicking frog, fastened to his seat with a skewer. "For shame," said Ben indignantly. Peter had, for the present, exhausted his stock of Haarlem anecdotes, and now, having nothing to do but skate, he and his 3 companions were hastening to catch up with Lambert and Ben. "That English lad is fleet enough," said Peter. "If he were a born Hollander, he could do no better. Generally these John Bulls make but a sorry figure on skates. Halloo! Here you are, Van Monen. Why, we hardly hoped for the honor of meeting you again. Whom were you flying from in such haste?" "Snails," retorted Lambert. "What kept you?" "We have been talking, and besides, we halted once to give Poot a chance to rest." "He begins to look rather worn out," said Lambert in a low voice. Just then a beautiful iceboat with reefed sail and flying streamers swept leisurely by. Its deck was filled with children muffled up to their chins. Looking at them from the ice you could see only smiling little faces embedded in bright-colored woolen wrappings. They were singing a chorus in honor of St. Nicholas. The music, starting in the discord of 100 childish voices, floated, as it rose, into exquisite harmony. "Friends of sailors and of children, double claim have we, as in youthful joy we're sailing o'er a frozen sea. Nicholas, St. Nicholas, let us sing to thee. While through wintry air we're rushing, as our voices blend, are you near us? Do you hear us, Nicholas, our friend? Nicholas, St. Nicholas, love can never end. Sunny sparkles, bright before us, chase away the cold. Hearts where sunny thoughts are welcome never can grow old. Nicholas, St. Nicholas, never can grow old. Pretty gift and loving lesson, festival and glee, bid us thank thee as we're sailing o'er the frozen sea. Nicholas, St. Nicholas, so we sing to thee." End of chapter. Chapter 20 of Hans Brinker. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording is by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. Hans Brinker, or The Silver Skates, by Mary Mapes Dodge. Chapter 20. Jacob Poot Changes the Plan. The last note died away in the distance. Our boys, who in their vain efforts to keep up with the boat had felt that they were skating backward, turned to look at one another. "How beautiful that was!" exclaimed Van Monen. "Just like a dream." Jacob drew close to Ben, giving his usual approving nod as he spoke. "Dat ish gut. Dat ish the best way. I shay better to take to Leyden mit a boat." "Take a boat!" exclaimed Ben in dismay. "Why, man, our plan was to skate, not to be carried like little children." "Teufels!" retorted Jacob. "Dat ish no little, no babies, to go for boat." The boys laughed, but exchanged uneasy glances. It would be great fun to jump on an ice boat, if they had a chance, but to abandon so shamefully their grand undertaking, who could think of such a thing? An animated discussion arose at once. Captain Peter brought his party to a halt. "Boys," said he, "it strikes me that we should consult Jacob's wishes in this matter. He started the excursion, you know." "Pooh!" sneered Carl, throwing a contemptuous glance at Jacob. "Who's tired? We can rest all night in Leyden." Ludwig and Lambert looked anxious and disappointed. It was no slight thing to lose the credit of having skated all the way from Broek to The Hague and back again, but both agreed that Jacob should decide the question. Good-natured, tired Jacob.
He read the popular sentiment at a glance.
"Oh, no," he said in Dutch. "I was joking. We will skate, of course."
The boys gave a delighted shout and started on again with renewed vigor. All but Jacob. He tried his best not to seem fatigued, and by not saying a word saved his breath and energy for the great business of skating. But in vain. Before long the stout body grew heavier and heavier, the tottering limbs weaker and weaker. Worse than all, the blood, anxious to get as far as possible from the ice, mounted to the puffy, good-natured cheeks and made the roots of his thin yellow hair glow into a fiery red. This kind of work is apt to summon vertigo, of whom good Hans Andersen writes, the same who hurls daring young hunters from the mountains, or spins them from the sharpest heights of the glaciers, or catches them as they tread the stepping stones of the mountain torrent. Vertigo came, unseen, to Jacob. After tormenting him a while, with one touch sending a chill from head to foot, with the next scorching every vein with fever, she made the canal rock and tremble beneath him, the white sails bow and spin as they passed, then cast him heavily upon the ice.
"Halloo!" cried Van Mounen. "There goes Poot!"
Ben sprang hastily forward. "Jacob! Jacob, are you hurt?" Peter and Carl were lifting him. The face was white enough now. It seemed like a dead face. Even the good-natured look was gone. A crowd collected. Peter unbuttoned the poor boy's jacket, loosened his red tippet, and blew between the parted lips. "Stand off, good people!" he cried. "Give him air!"
"Lay him down!"
called out a woman from the crowd.
"Stand him upon his feet!"
shouted another.
"Give him wine,"
growled a stout fellow who was driving a loaded sled.
Yes, give him wine,"
echoed everybody. Ludwig and Lambert shouted in concert, "Wine! Wine! Who has wine?" A sleepy-headed Dutchman began to fumble mysteriously under the heaviest of blue jackets, saying as he did so, "Not so much noise, young masters, not so much noise. The boy was a fool to faint like a girl." "Wine, quick!" cried Peter, who, with Ben's help, was rubbing Jacob from head to foot. Ludwig stretched forth his hand imploringly toward the Dutchman, who, with an air of great importance, was still fumbling beneath the jacket. "Do hurry! He will die! Has anyone else any wine?"
"He is dead,"
said an awful voice from among the bystanders. This startled the Dutchman. "Have a care," he said, reluctantly drawing forth a small blue flask. "This is schnapps. A little is enough." A little was enough. The paleness gave way to a faint flush. Jacob opened his eyes, and, half bewildered, half ashamed, feebly tried to free himself from those who were supporting him. There was no alternative now for our party but to have their exhausted comrade carried, in some way, to Leyden. As for expecting him to skate any more that day, the thing was impossible. In truth, by this time each boy began to entertain secret yearnings toward ice-boats, and to avow a Spartan resolve not to desert Jacob. Fortunately, a gentle, steady breeze was setting southward. If some accommodating skipper would but come along, matters would not be quite so bad after all. Peter hailed the first sail that appeared. The men in the stern would not even look at him. 3 drays on runners came along, but they were already loaded to the utmost. Then an ice boat, a beautiful, tempting little one, whizzed past like an arrow. The boys had just time to stare eagerly at it when it was gone. In despair, they resolved to prop up Jacob with their strong arms, as well as they could, and take him to the nearest village. At that moment, a very shabby ice boat came in sight. With but little hope of success, Peter hailed at the same time taking off his hat and flourishing it in the air. The sail was lowered, then came the scraping sound of the brake, and a pleasant voice called from the deck, "What now?" "Will you take us on?" cried Peter,
hurrying with his companions as fast as he could, for the boat was bringing to some distance ahead. "Will you take us on?" "We'll pay for the ride," shouted Carl. The man on board scarcely noticed him except to mutter something about its not being a trekschuit. Still looking toward Peter, he asked, "How many?" "6." "Well, it's Nicholas's day. Up with you. Young gentleman sick?" He nodded toward Jacob. "Yes, broken down. Skated all the way from Broek," answered Peter. "Do you go to Leyden?" "That's as the wind says. It's blowing that way now. Scramble up." Poor Jacob! If that willing Mrs. Poot had only appeared just then, her services would have been invaluable. It was as much as the boys could do to hoist him into the boat. All were in at last. The skipper, puffing away at his pipe, let out the sail, lifted the brake, and sat in the stern with folded arms. "Whew! How fast we go!" cried Ben. "This is something like. Feel better, Jacob?" "Much better, I thanks you." "Oh, you'll be as good as new in 10 minutes. This makes a fellow feel like a bird." Jacob nodded and blinked his eyes. "Don't go to sleep, Jacob. It's too cold. You might never wake up, you know. Persons often freeze to death in that way." "I no sleep," said Jacob confidently, and in 2 minutes he was snoring. Carl and Ludwig laughed. "We must wake him," cried Ben. "It is dangerous, I tell you. Jacob! Captain Peter interfered, for 3 of the boys were helping Ben for the fun of the thing. "Nonsense! Don't shake him. Let him alone, boys. One never snores like that when one's freezing. Cover him up with something. Here, this cloak will do. Hey, skipper!" And he looked towards the stern for permission to use it. The man nodded. "There," said Peter, tenderly adjusting the garment. "Let him sleep. He will be as frisky as a lamb when he wakes. How far are we from Leyden, skipper?" "Not more'n a couple of pipes," replied a voice rising from smoke like the genii of fairy tales. Puff, puff. "Likely not more'n 1.5. Puff, puff. If this wind holds. Puff, puff, puff." "What is the man saying, Lambert?" asked Ben, who was holding his mittened hands against his cheeks to ward off the cutting air. "He says we're about 2 pipes from Leyden. Half the boors here on the canal measure distance by the time it takes them to finish a pipe." "How ridiculous!" "See here, Benjamin Dobbs," retorted Lambert, growing unaccountably indignant at Ben's quiet smile. "See here, you've a way of calling every other thing you see on this side of the German Ocean ridiculous. It may suit you, this word, but it doesn't suit me. When you want anything ridiculous, just remember your English custom of making the Lord Mayor of London, at his installation, count the nails in a horseshoe to prove his learning." "Who told you we had any such custom as that?" cried Ben, looking grave in an instant. "Why, I know it. No use of anyone telling me. It's in all the books, and it's true. It strikes me," continued Lambert, laughing in spite of himself, "that you have been kept in happy ignorance of a good many ridiculous things on your side of the map." "Humph!" exclaimed Ben, trying not to smile. "I'll inquire to this Lord Mayor business when I get home. There must be some mistake. Brrr! How fast we're going! This is glorious!" It was a grand sail, or ride, I scarcely know what to call it. Perhaps fly would be the best word, for the boys felt very much as Sinbad did when, tied to the roc's leg, he darted through the clouds, or as Bellerophon felt when he shot through the air on the back of his winged horse, Pegasus. Sailing, riding, or flying, whichever it was, everything was rushing past, backward, and before they had time to draw a deep breath, Leyden itself, with its high, peaked roofs, flew halfway to meet them. When the city came in sight, it was high time to waken the sleeper. That feat accomplished, Peter's prophecy came to pass. Master Jacob was quite restored and in excellent spirits.
The skipper made a feeble remonstrance when Peter, with hearty thanks, endeavored to slip some silver pieces into his tough brown palm. "Ye see, young master," said he, drawing away his hand, "the regular line of trade's one thing, and a favor's another." "I know it," said Peter, "but those boys and girls of yours will want sweets when you get home. Buy them some in the name of Saint Nicholas." The man grinned. "Aye, true enough. I've young uns in plenty, a clean boatload of 'em. You are a sharp young master at guessing." This time the knotty hand hitched forward again, quite carelessly it seemed, but its palm was upward. Peter hastily dropped in the money and moved away. The sail came tumbling down. Scrape, scrape went the brake, scattering an ice shower round the boat. "Goodbye, skipper!" shouted the boys, seizing their skates and leaping from the deck one by one. "Many thanks to you." "Goodbye. Hold! Here, stop! I want my coat." Ben was carefully assisting his cousin over the side of the boat. "What is the man shouting about? Oh, I know! You have his wrapper round your shoulders." "Dat ish true," answered Jacob, half jumping, half tumbling down upon the framework. "Dat ish vot make him so heavy." "Made you so heavy, you mean, Poot?" "Ja, made you so heavy. Dat ish true," said Jacob innocently as he worked himself free of the big wrapper. "Dere, now you hand it mit him, straightway, and tells him I was much thanks for dat." "Ho, for an inn!" cried Peter as they stepped into the city. "Be brisk, my fine fellows." End of chapter.